Welcome to a video with 60 plus plants for year-round interest. This is plants that are going to look good spring, summer, fall, and especially show off in the winter garden. So we're going to jump right in with this, not too much talking here, but stick around toward the end of the video because some of our favorites from our Raleigh garden are actually toward the end of the video. This is a gold thread cypress called Paul's Gold. You may know Gold Mop is the other one it's been around forever that's similar to this. This one is more heat tolerant. That was what was selected for. So these are hardy in zone 5 to 8, but you know, they're quite a bit more overall heat tolerant. And we've had one in a container at the house for maybe 3 years now. It's such a great container plant with this soft foliage and the weeping habit, and you can see how great it looks in the winter time here. I mean, this is February as we're shooting this, and it's super, super bright pop of color out here. And I think it's holding its color a little better than when we saw some gold mops we were shooting yesterday. I think it's hold on to that yellow color just a bit better. So that may have been part of the selection as well, differentiating this one from gold mop. They'll get as big as you want them to let them get. So here's one. These are in the Southern Living Plant Collection. So in the Southern Living Plant Collection container, you can see how nice and full and round that plant is. You can shear this off and hold it probably at this height or a little bit bigger for years and years and years. Or you can just start to let it grow and it will slowly creep up in kind of a pyramidal habit. So these have been obviously sheared off to be more roundish, but their natural growing habit is a little more like this. So if you just leave it be, it'll just keep creeping up, and it'll creep up as long as you want to let it keep growing. I had a 6-foot version of this beside my deck at the old house, and I cut it down to 3 feet. It didn't have anything on it whatsoever after I cut it, and it just flushed right back out from that. So they're actually resettable as well, which not a lot of conifers, not all conifers are that way by any stretch of the imagination, but this one can be reset in the future. But this is Paul's Gold, False Cypress or Camellia cypress, really great plant, and we've been super impressed with the heat tolerance in our Raleigh garden. This is Florida Sunshine Illicium. Our Florida Sunshine Illicium at the house now is probably right around 6 feet in height, something like that. This is a great part shade or shade evergreen that's kind of ever yellow or ever chartreuse, I guess we'll call it. Really beautiful. The chartreuse color against those pink stems on this plant really make it shine. This is a plant that really lights up a part shade or shade space, and every time I film in our back garden, if this thing is in line of sight in the video, I'm getting questions about it because it just brightens up a kind of what would be kind of a shady dark spot next to our shed in the back garden. The other thing this plant gives you is contrast. So here is an evergreen rhododendron behind it, another shade plant, right? And you see how these two things contrast against each other. So this is one of those plants that, you know, not only stands out on its own or in a small group or in a small hedging situation where you want something that's 6 to 10 feet tall, something like that. It's also going to contrast with other things that you put in that hedge with it. Here's a Camellia sasanqua that I've had on the channel several times over the years. I actually moved a very large one at the old house. If you want to figure out how to move a large shrub, that's a Yuletide Camellia that was in that video. And I've also got a single plant video on Yuletide Camellia as well. This is a red flowering Camellia sasanqua that blooms near Christmas. Perfect name, Yuletide, right, for something that's red flowering near Christmas time. This is a great kind of, I would say, medium-sized camellia. It will creep up as large as you want to let it grow in time, but it has, as you can see in these containers, a slightly more upright habit. Some of the other ones we show off on the channel now are more spreading, lower mounding ones that I would put in a different video of low foundation plants or something like that. But Yuletide is a more vigorous, upright grower with a compact habit. Great dark green foliage. We're actually shooting this in February, and so it's got a little bit of a bronzing to the leaves, just a little bit, so not quite as green as it is during the growing season. But these, again, grow vigorously in time, kind of slow at first, vigorously in time, set flower buds in the summer and bloom in the fall up until about Christmas time with these red flowers. Pollinators absolutely love this one, so I like to point out to folks that a lot of times we love these full double flowers that, you know, that are you know, big and full flowers. But this one has a single flat red flower, but because all the flower parts are exposed in the middle, the pollinators go crazy for this thing on warmer days in November and December. This is a really nice new crop of Goshiki Osmanthus. Goshiki, mentioned this one many times on the channel. There's an individual plant video if you want to go back and learn more about Goshiki Osmanthus. But Goshiki means 5 colors in Japanese, and so when this thing leaves out in the spring, it has kind of a pinkish red new foliage on it, and then it settles into these interesting variegations, and brighter in the newer growth and kind of darker green in the older growth on the plant. It looks wicked, like it would just eat you alive, but it's not really at all. It does flower, and it gets fragrant flowers like other Osmanthus, but I've said many times it takes years for this thing to bloom for some reason. It's a little bit shy to flower, that's what I would say initially, but once it's established in the ground for a while. One at J.C. Ralston Arboretum, around 8 feet tall. I think if you see this on a tag, you're going to see 3 to 6 feet, somewhere in that range, typically for the height, but it will get bigger than that like any other leafy evergreen plant. You could shear these pretty hard in the late winter, early spring into either pyramidal shapes or upright narrow shapes, or however you want to keep them. And then that new foliage will come out on it, and it's super, super striking against that variegation. This is Obsession Nandina from the Southern Living Plant Collection. This is a really great Nandina. It is one that doesn't flower, so it doesn't have the invasive tendencies that other Nandina domesticas have. It turns this, has this incredible red color on it. So when it's actively growing, the new growth is kind of reddish. And then in the winter, the old growth from the previous year's growth turns this really, really vivid red color. You can see these from across the field. It's really going to be hard to, in this blown out sunlight out here, to really tell how vivid red these Obsession Nandinas are. There's a group of Gulfstream that is going to be in the same video back here behind it. And if you could see the two of them side by side, you can see how much more color Obsession Nandina actually has than Gulfstream. Gulfstream's been around for a long time. Both of these can be maintained, are maintainable at, let's say, 2 feet in height up to probably a little over 4 feet in height, something like that in time. So I would prefer to, you know, once they get up into this range like this, probably to do a little bit of pruning on them after that initial flush every season. Then you can get another flush on them later. And then that keeps this really full, compact habit that the top of that plant will turn this bright red color in the wintertime. And then down in the plant, it's green, and it produces this really interesting two-tone color during the winter months. There's nothing more showy in a winter garden than this Obsession Nandina. Here's a big crop of Sunshine Ligustrum. We're at Panoramic Farms over a little east of Charlotte today. They sell to garden centers and other places, but you can see how good of a grower David and his crew are here. This is an incredible crop of Sunshine Ligustrum. You see the yellow on them right now. They've got them under some shade, and they'll actually take them out in a little bit of sun before they leave here. They're best grown in part shade in a nursery situation, and then they're full sun out in our gardens at home. So there's some plants like that are weirdly tricky like that, where you grow azaleas in the full sun, old-fashioned azaleas in the full sun in a nursery, and then grow them in the shade at your house. Some are opposite from that. It's kind of weird. But Sunshine Ligustrum, great. I don't want to call it sterile, but it doesn't flower, so it doesn't produce fruit, so it's not like other Chinese privet in that way, and it has this gold coloration throughout the year. You can size control this thing ever how you want to do it. You want to make a 2-foot meatball, make a 2-foot meatball. If you want to make a 5-foot tall pyramid, make a 5-foot tall pyramid. Doesn't really matter at all. You can shape them and prune them however you want to, and it always is going to flush back out with this really bright gold coloration, which then it holds any part of this plant. And you can see these are in the shade, but where the sun's peeking around this corner right here, you see all the great color on them. So a little bit of sunlight, you know, direct sunlight on them just keeps this rich pop of color. I've covered it many different ways over the years on the channel, and you know, again, you can let them get 6 feet tall or a little more if you want to in the future, or size control it however you want to. But really great low screening plant, specimen plant, corner foundation plant, a container plant, all kinds of different uses you could come up with for something that has this kind of color year round. Here's a crop of gold mop cypress, and they've actually have these under a little bit of shade where they're growing them. And then they'll take the shade cloth off and they'll finish them in more sun, so they'll get much brighter coloration on them, because these get planted in the sun and the landscape. I said this before and I'll say it again. It's kind of funny because there are folks that want the gold mops that only get this tall, and then people that want the gold mops that get this tall. It's all the same plant. This plant will get as big as you want to let it get, up to 20 feet in height if you want to let it get 20 feet in height. But most people, I think, are going to use this. So you can, this could go in a lot of different videos, right? I could put this on low foundation plants because it could absolutely be kept 3 or 4 feet as a little round fluffy ball that's, you know, lacy, soft to the touch. I could put it in a specimen plant video, right, where you'd put this on the corner of your foundation and let it get kind of tall and narrow and wispy. I could put it as a screening plant video. I could put it as a small screening plant video, like all kinds of things that you can do with this plant. And you can just size control it, prune it however you want to prune it, or put it in a place where you can let it get big and let it really take on, you know, basically almost becoming like a small ornamental tree in your landscape. But I love this plant. It's soft to the touch. It's easy. The more sun, the more color. Again, they're growing these in a tiny bit of shade, that's the reason you're seeing them not as bright as you normally would in my videos, if that's how it's showing up. The ones that are over here a little bit have a little bit more sun on them, and you can see a little bit more color on them. So they'll take this shade cloth off and they'll just color right up, and they'll send them out to retail, and they'll be beautiful gold mops on the tables. This is lemon lime Nandina. This is a gold or chartreuse foliage Nandina. It's really super compact habit, as you can see in these containers. Anytime they're actively growing, they're covered in this kind of chartreuse new foliage, and then they typically have an outer layer on them. These are actually being grown under a little bit of shade here, and it's helping the plant, it's helping to grow the plant, you know, stretching them a little bit. But they'll actually move them out into some sun. They'll take the shade off the top of them. This is a retractable shade cloth that's over my head here. They'll retract that shade, put a little sunlight on them. They'll turn that really bright, rich golden color, and then they'll send them out to retail for garden centers or landscapers or whoever, you know, in the spring. We're filming this in February, so it doesn't really matter all that much. You're not selling many plants in February. But as soon as the sunlight hits these things, they basically turn to sunlight. And this is an amazing Nandina. It doesn't flower, so it doesn't fruit, so it's not invasive. And I will say, this is what I'm going to say about lemon lime Nandinas. I think this plant requires 2 to 3 years in the ground to become a great ornamental plant. The first year I've had these, second year in the ground, second year in the ground, nice ornamental plants. And then something happens to them once they get some real roots under them and they really start to get some mass on them. They become great ornamental plants. And we've seen that in several landscapes over the years, where once they reach kind of a 3 foot by 3 foot size in the landscape, they really take on that great chartreuse color and keep that color kind of year round. This is Carex Feather Falls, and you can see it has the green center and then kind of a yellowish gold edge on it. It tends to be the new growth tends to be a little more white in the spring, and then it settles into that kind of yellowish color during the winter time. There's a reverse variegation of this, or a slightly different variegation of this also on the market, and then a solid green one called Ribbon Falls. But it's Feather Falls, Moon Falls, Ribbon Falls. All of them have a lot of what I would call hybrid vigor. They're very fast growing, so a lot of the Carexes, lots of different Carexes from all over the world, including native and non-native ones, but there's some hybridizing going on that's created some hybrid vigor, where we see Carexes now getting, you know, this one is probably 2 feet wide in our garden and 1.5 feet tall, something like that. They do flower. Flower's kind of insignificant down in the plant like that. It's not, you know, not particular. There are interesting Carex out there that do have more interesting flowers on them, and we've shown a couple of those off in the on the channel before. But this one's just mainly grown for this, you know, lacy, you know, variegated foliage. It's like this year round. I'm filming this in February. How could you lose with a plant that looks like this in February? You can choose whether or not to cut them back based on how good they look coming out of winter. So if they're rough looking coming out of winter, you can cut them back. Don't cut them way down to the ground. Leave them up just to, you know, like this. and then new growth will emerge from that if you need to, but we haven't had to cut our feather falls back. I think at some point though, we'll have to pop it out of the ground and divide it at some point, because it is, again, a much more vigorous Carex than others. Look at this color guard Yucca in a big mass. Amazing thing about this plant, this is February. I'm in a plant nursery that is literally covering all of their plants in the nursery because there's 14 degrees coming in the next few nights. They don't even put these Yucca pot tight. This thing is so cold hardy. It's cold hardy up to zone 4 or 5. This is color guard Yucca, and it's Yucca filamentosa, and you can see the little filaments along the stem, and that gold center blade. The center of this blade has this gold color. It'll get some slight pink hues in it in the winter time, change up a bit, and then in the spring and summer be all just this gold center and green outer striping on the foliage. Of course, it's prickly. If you want to get yourself in here and figure out how to get hurt by it, you can, but it's not a plant you're ever going to have to do any maintenance to. It will grow about 2 feet in height or so, and then you'll get offsets on it, so it'll get wider in time. You can cut those offsets off and start new plants, or you can just let it continue to get wider. It will get a flower spike on it during the late spring, summer, white, kind of dangling off-white flowers on it that the pollinators absolutely go crazy for. Looks like a plant that couldn't possibly be cold hardy, you know, down to, you know, in the negative degrees, but it absolutely is. And just beautiful in mass like this. This is Ilex verticulata. This is a deciduous holly that really, really shows off in the winter time. With these red berries that, of course, the birds can take advantage of during the winter months. This is typically going to be used in some sort of low hedging along the edge of a property, or, you know, you can do these one, you know, but you need a male pollinator. Like you need to match these up. You need a male pollinator for these Ilex verticulata, or these winterberry hollies. And you need to make sure it's matched properly. This is an early flowering one, so you need an early flowering male, like Jim Dandy would be an example of an early flowering male. So hopefully when you shop for these, they'll have the male that goes with it. But I would recommend that you get the male. It doesn't matter where it gets planted, as long as it's on your, you know, on the same property, and then get like 3 or 5 of these, so that they really show off in a large group. And North Carolina does a pretty good job using these along the interstate in large masses. And when you're driving by this, it's just absolutely, it's unbelievable. We really haven't covered these all that much over the years because it's not, you know, it's a green shrub. It flowers in the spring and it's just a green holly the rest of the year. It really comes to life when it loses its leaves. And what other plant would we talk about coming to life after it goes dormant in the winter time and loses its leaves? But that's when this plant actually comes to life. Beneficial for our natives, pollinators in the spring, and beneficial for our native birds during the winter time. So a really great plant. But again, you'll need a male pollinator. Make sure that you know, this one's called Red Sprite, and Jim Dandy would match to it, but whatever one you're buying, make sure you're buying an appropriate male, because they need to bloom at the same time. That's pretty important. This is a Prostrate Plum Yew, or Japanese Plum Yew. These come in fastigiate selections that are straight up and down, and then ones that get 2 to 3 feet and 3 to 4 feet. This plant has a lot of different shapes and sizes, but this Prostrate Plum Yew we will frequently see on, I would say, the majority of shade gardens that we cover in the Southeast. If they have dry shade or a bank or a slope or somewhere where it's not staying evenly moist throughout the season, these Prostrate Plum Yews are going to be used. And it's just such a great plant for that, for covering up some ground in a difficult, maybe a space that has some root competition in shade or park shade conditions. Super, super slow growing. So this is one of those plants I like to say occasionally, there's a reason this is going to cost more than other things. I've rooted these things and had them take 2.5 years or more to fill a 1-gallon container. And so this is a 3-gallon, a squat 3-gallon container. From a rooted cutting, this could be as much as 3 to even 4 years to have a finished 3-gallon container. It's not a lot of work out here because they're not demanding, and it won't be demanding for you either in the ground. Really super, super low maintenance plant. In the future, It may get a little wider than you want it. It's going to be a while, but if it ever does, you can just prune this thing back and shape it back into, you know, narrow it back in with a pair of pruners pretty much any time, spring or early summer, without any problem. I always say things that are drought tolerant, like this one is, you do need to keep an eye on it to start with. I mean, if you're putting it in an area with root competition, it's going to take a minute for it to get rooted into place. But once it is, this is a really, really great plant. And what I really love, and what Steph and I really love about this plant, is the texture it offers. A lot of things that we put in shady spaces are going to have big, like palmate leaves, like a Fatsia or something like that. And you imagine you take something that's tropical looking like that and you put it with something that's soft textured looking like this. And this thing actually is soft to the touch. Looks kind of spiny probably in the video, but it's actually soft to the touch. You put those things together and create those contrast and these different shades of green that we can have in shady spaces, and you can really make a shady space pop, you know, with or without flowers. This is Dwarf Sweet Box or Himalayan Sweet Box, really super compact, lustrous green foliage evergreen that is for shade or part shade conditions typically, slightly moist, not super, super dry shade, but really great evergreen foliage. It doesn't, you know, it's hard to find sometimes low growing evergreen things for the for our shady conditions. What makes this one really unique is we're filming this in February and you can see flower buds forming along the stems here. Super, super, really in winter. I mean, it's late winter when it blooms, but in winter, these get like a vanilla scented white flower. And you really, this is one of those plants you could walk by it 10 times and not necessarily see the flowers on it because they're down in the plant just a little bit, but you will smell them. It will feel, you know, it's very, very aromatic. I really love this shrub for, you know, because again, we don't necessarily have a tremendous amount of low evergreen things that we can have in shady spaces, ground covers with this kind of lustrous, you know, green foliage, and on something that won't get out of control. So it does spread, and it spreads by, you know, it's slowly but surely, like right there is a piece coming up on the edge of this one, on the, you know, on the edge of that container, but it's a very, very slow spread. So 10 years would go by before you'd need to add any control to this thing. So that's another nice thing about presenting ground covers for the shade that won't eat your entire shade garden. This is a great low hedging plant. This is green mountain boxwood. Normally when you get the word green in the name, it's really referring to, we all know boxwoods are green, right? But it's most of the time it's referring to, on these hybrids and these Japanese boxwoods, that they stay green during the winter time, because a lot of the older varieties turn kind of an amber color during the winter time. This particular variety resists that. They're hardy in zone 4 to 9, so I imagine in zone 4 they're still going to get quite a bit of that off coloring during the winter time, but for those of us in the south, they'll just hold this green color through the winter. So it's a good name for it. Again, anytime you see that green in the name, that's probably what they're referring to, that it stays green 12 months out of the year. This one is a more upright, narrow habit, and you can see how they've cone shaped these, but they haven't had to do much to cone shape them. This is just how this one grows. And so this one, you know, I'm putting this in a video with low hedging plants, okay? And it's the perfect plant for that because it'll get 5 or 6 feet tall. So if you don't need to have a 20-foot border, this is a perfect plant for that. But this one really presents itself well for containers. If you have a container on your porch and you want something narrow that's not going to bite you when you walk by it, perfect plant for that. Also for topiaries, this one's probably amongst the best of the topiariable boxwoods, just because it's perfectly upright. It tends to select a leader very easily on its own, and it can be turned into 2-ball and 3-ball topiaries, that kind of thing. Of course, deer resistant and rabbit resistant and all the other things that boxwoods are good for, but it has a very distinct upright, narrow growth habit. Here's a beautiful crop of Osmanthus fragrans. This is a great screening plant, and I'll tell you, this is the only plant that we have in our screen that we have 3 of. So that's how much we like Osmanthus fragrans. This plant actually has fairly insignificant, what we would call kind of insignificant flowers, right? Considering that plant's 6 feet tall, that flower is teeny tiny, but it has the most amazing fragrance. These will start blooming typically late September as the nighttime temperatures cool. And then they'll bloom pretty much all winter long until early spring, except for the worst of the winter. So the worst of the winter will shut them down, typically sometime in mid-December through mid to late January, they won't be doing a whole lot of blooming, but here we are in the middle of February, and whatever remaining flowers this thing had carried through the winter are now in the process of opening. Kind of takes a warmer afternoon to really get the fragrance going. A lot of times I can't smell them all that much in the morning, but in the 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the evening on a slightly warmish afternoon is when you really, our entire garden can be filled with this very sweet fragrance. Super, super tight, compact growth habit, not the most cold hardy thing in the world. And when we're using plants as screening plants, frequently we're putting them out on the edge of the yard. We're really exposing them to wind and cold and other things. So, you know, this is like hardy in zone 7B to 10. I would think that out in 7B, you know, this is probably maybe a corner foundation plant for you. You know, so it's up against, you know, you're using it as to get the fragrance on it, but not as a screening plant necessarily. Probably, you know, and we're in zone 8A, and we're in a slightly protected space. Our neighborhood's not like wide open. It's wooded kind of neighborhood. Certainly by zone 8B, they can just be out in the open. But even these are in zone 8A here in the Charlotte area in the containers, and the winter's done a little bit of work on them. It hasn't hurt them badly in any way, but it's definitely off-colored them and that kind of thing. But really great plant. And again, you know, we don't have more than one of anything hardly. So if we have 3 of something, we definitely like it. This is a really interesting screening plant or specimen plant. You can grow one of these on the corner of a foundation, or you can line a few of them up in your screen or in your mixed screen. This is a Hollywood juniper. These gonna have kind of a mind of their own a little bit. I love the habit of these. This is great for coastal gardens, and just a lot of us can grow these. They're hardy for most people watching, and they kind of have a mind of their own. Sometimes they can look like they just got twisted in a circle in time. You know, where you take a branch like this and it turns and twists, and Torolusa, it just twists around the plant in time and just become naturally really, really beautiful. And not a plant that I want to put in where I'm going to have to shear it a whole lot. So it really needs to be in a place where it can get large and it can do the thing that it does, which is become kind of a unique to itself, upright plant. But it does become a pretty good screening plant in time. Where it looks a little thin and wispy here in this container, it actually does become quite full. I have seen these beside a building down at East Carolina University over 30 feet tall and probably 20 feet wide. I mean, really massive plants in the future. So keep that in mind. You could at some point, you know, shear them and cut them back some, but this one will need some space and time to become really one of the more interesting horticulture plant, you know, plants for ornamental horticulture. You know, it's not going to, each of them are going to have a kind of a mind of their own. Definitely more upright and narrow overall, but in time will eat a little bit of space, so keep that in mind. Okay. This is one of my favorite upright junipers. This is Blue Point juniper. Grew these for years in my nursery. We don't have a lot of choices for blue conifers in the South, and these are hardy in zone 4 to 9, so pretty much everybody watching can grow them. But we don't have a lot, again, as you get to zone 8 and 9, we really don't have a lot of options for having blue conifers. So this is a nice blue-ish selection, not as blue as Colorado blue spruce or anything, but definitely has a blue hue to it. What's nice about growing junipers as screening plants versus arborvitae? So let's flip over to emerald arborvitae and say that plant down in the southeast is not happy in the heat. It's just really not overall happy in the heat, where junipers tend to gain drought tolerance in time and just tolerance to everything, to air pollution and to, you know, deer resistance and, you know, coastal issues and all kinds of things that other plants, you know, just don't tolerate as well. So, you know, consider using junipers if you have tougher conditions, or, you know, you're planning on planting a wall of conifers somewhere and you're not necessarily going to be able to get water to them easily. I'm probably going to go, you know, pick some of the junipers, that Hollywood juniper, Blue Point juniper, Taylor's juniper. Those are probably going to become more resistant to some of, you know, the abuse that we sometimes give our plants in the landscape, more than emerald arborvitae would. This is a golden Oakland holly from the Southern Living Plant Collection. This is a great upright, narrow holly. The one we have in our garden in Raleigh is now 12 feet tall or so. I had to get on a ladder the other day to prune the top of it. So I know it's right around 12 feet tall, and it's almost as narrow as this one is at 5 or 6 feet. I mean, it's only gotten to this wide. And so where a lot of these other hollies are naturally upright, and a lot of these plants are naturally upright, they do tend to add width as they get taller. This one is really, really good about staying super narrow. I really like the gold coloration, the variegation in this plant. A lot of the gold hollies or variegated hollies, to me, are not great looking plants. Sometimes they just look like sick hollies, if I'm being honest. But this one just looks really fantastic, and it's a bright pop of color. We've got it in our part shade conditions in our Raleigh garden, but it would prefer to be out here in the full sun like these are, and these are much brighter. It's like one side of ours is really bright because it's getting more sun than the other. They're self-fruiting. You know, spring flowering, self-fruiting. I haven't seen many berries on it yet, but it really just doesn't need them at all to be a show-off in the garden. So this is going to be a great corner foundation plant or a part of a screen where you need narrower plants to make up your screen. This is teddy bear magnolia. This is another narrow, upright selection of our native Magnolia grandiflora, which can get gigantic. This one is typically used in narrower applications. Always comes with this cute little teddy bear magnolia tag, and that's how I can recognize it. I will say, so let's see some differences between this one and Little Gem. Little Gem, probably the most common of the narrower upright magnolias. There's a few on the market. You'll notice on teddy bear has more of a roundish leaf. It's still a football shaped leaf. It's longer this direction than it is wide, but you can see that it's kind of a little more stunted. So it's a shorter leaf. It's got a great coloration on the back. I would say much, much better overall leaf coloration than Little Gem. I think overall it has a slightly more compact habit on its own without any nursery. The nursery actually having to work on it is hard. Standing in a group of Kaleidoscope Abelia in the wintertime, and in the winter you can really tell why this plant is called Kaleidoscope. During the growing season, it has it's a variegated leaf with a kind of a yellow and a dark green variegation, and then it blooms in the summertime. Pollinators go crazy for these Abelia. This is a dwarf Abelia that stays low and mounding, but then in the wintertime, Kaleidoscope is the name, and this is what it does in the wintertime. You'll get these oranges, splashes of oranges and almost reds and all kinds of interesting colors. It'll depend on where you are in the country as to how much color you're going to get during the winter. These are hardy in zone 6 to 9. Zone 6, they'll thin out a little bit. They're not quite as evergreen, but they'll fully color up, almost purple, okay? And then as you get toward the more southern areas, it'll hold more of that just basic variegation that it has. I don't want to say basic, it's a beautiful plant in the summertime. I may lean toward liking Radiance just a little bit more than this. It tends to stay a little more compact, tends to hold its variegation a little better year round, and it has a little less of the spiky growth that all of these dwarf Abelia get. And truly, all of these dwarf Abelia, in time, they're perfect little low mounds. They're 2 to 3 feet in height and 3 to 4 feet in width ultimately, but they'll start to get this spiky growth that comes out on them, and you have to prune down into the plant occasionally. No big deal overall, but Kaleidoscope does get a little more of that spiky growth than I see in other places. But in the wintertime, it does this, and it just, I mean, this is, I don't know, 80 plants, and every single one of them has something interesting about it, and oranges and dark purples and yellows and other colors showing up in them. This is a really cool hedging plant right here. This is an upright growing camellia, almost grows Christmas tree-like. This one's called Spring Festival. We're seeing more and more hybrid camellias out on the market doing various things, and lots of other species that we haven't used in our ornamental landscapes a whole lot. Over the years, we're seeing more and more introductions and more crosses. So you'll see that Camellia X, Spring Festival on this one. It is, I know it's a hybrid of Cuspidata, which is one of the species, Camellia species, Cupsidate or something like that. Camellia, I think, is the common name for those. But this one has was bred for very, very upright habit. And you see it's an interesting blooming time. We're filming this in February. It looks like most of these flowers won't open until late February or early March. They're starting to show a little bit of color now, a little cold weather happening, so they'll slow down a bit, and then they'll start to open up a little later. And you can see all the way down into the oldest growth here, there's flowers on this thing, and the way it's presenting itself upright and narrow like this, you'll be seeing flowers from top to bottom. And so this is like a light pink rose form, kind of a semi-double flower. I'd really like to take one of these home. We're in Charlotte filming, and this one's a little big for us to take home, but I actually want this plant because we have a narrow landscape, or small landscape, and we're always looking for something to put along the edge of it that's a perfect upright, narrow habit like this. So these are going to be hardians on a 7 to 9, and a really, really interesting hybrid camellia. This is a variegated pittosporum. There are some named varieties of this, and then there are some dwarf versions of this. So we have Mojo Pittosporum at the house, which is a dwarf version of this variegated Pittosporum tobira. This one right here, though, the regular variegated Pittosporum, I've seen this plant as tall as 15, 18 feet in height and 12, 15 feet in width. So where a lot of times in a container it looks like it's not going to get all that big, it will. I had a neighbor use these. They're great part shade screening plants is really the preferred use for these. If you're looking for, you know, Pittosporum are great ornamental plants, not the most cold hardy things in the world, but they're great ornamental plants. And you know, this is a variegated version. You'll get some reversion. You'll get, in the variegated one, you'll get occasionally some slightly different variegation, or even worse though, is that you'll occasionally get some green reversion in it. You want to cut that out if you see any of that green reversion. They do get a very sweet flower on them that's kind of, you're not going to see it. It's a flower that's typically down in the plant just a little bit. It's kind of orange scented flower. Pretty fast growing once it gets going, a little slow to start. But this is one of those plants that I can put a pittosporum in a, you know, in a very low, almost ground cover video. I can put it in a low shrub video. I can put it in a screening plant video. But those are very different. They're different varieties. And so the regular variegated Pittosporum, this thing will get quite large, and it's a great option for a screening plant in a part shade space. I'm going to jump into the video real quick and remind you that over on HortTube.com, our website, we have t-shirts available. I think there's 7 different designs, something like that. And there's also, if you want to learn how to use these plants and maintain these plants in your gardens, we have 2 separate video series for that. The Learn to Garden video series is all about learning to garden, how to design with the plants, where to use them, how to create good soil in your garden. And then the Weekly Garden Planner is a week-by-week maintenance schedule and ideas for thinking about what you should be doing on literally on a week-by-week basis. So we have those 2 items over on the website as well. Back to the video. This is Black Dragon Cryptomeria. Cryptomeria is Japanese cedar, would be the common name for Cryptomeria. And this is a plant that we have very dwarfing versions of, and we probably, if you're following along with the channel back in Raleigh, we probably have 4 different varieties that stay less than, you know, we could keep less than 3 feet in height, and then there are Yoshino Cryptomeria that can get 80 feet in height, something like that. And then this one's called Black Dragon. This one's kind of an interesting, upright, narrow one. It can be sheared pretty tight. So this would be an example of one that's been sheared pretty tight. And then there's other examples here where they're a bit thinner. I'll see some space. Every one of these is different. So interesting specimen plant for the garden for sure. Be a little bit harder to make a good. This one would, you know, it's in a going to be in a low screening video. This one will be a little harder though to make a full screen because again, the variability between each of them. But it's definitely a plant worth having because if you're just looking for not necessarily something you just can't completely see through, but you're looking for something that's tall and narrow and interesting, this is the plant for you. Okay, so these are just, every one of them is interesting and slightly different, but always upright and kind of narrow like this. Another surprisingly fast-growing screening plant here is Arizona cypress. When we see these in the wild out west, there can be kind of diminutive things out in the desert, but you bring them east, give them some water, and they can really, really take off in our landscapes. This one's blue ice, and I think it's a really great great blue color, and we don't get a lot of this in our southern gardens where we can have great blue conifers like this. Carolina Sapphire is probably the more known variety of these and tends to grow a little bit more Christmas tree-like, where blue ice can have a little bit its own imagination, just a little bit, I would say, you know, where it doesn't necessarily go quite as uniform, but I do think it has a slightly bluer color, you know, and I'm probably maybe making that up in my mind just a bit. But it's amazing that this, you know, desert dwelling plant, you know, coming east is such a good screening plant. We see the North Carolina Department of Transportation using these along the interstate in really tough slope spaces where there's no additional water happening on them. So a really great choice if you're trying to plant screening plants in an area that you're not necessarily going to be able to get water to them. Of course, you can, you know, the blue color is great as well. We have a neighbor though that's planted a Carolina Sapphire blue Arizona cypress in front of their house, and you know, it's basically eating the front of their house. And so be careful with this. This is probably not one to even put on a corner of a foundation. It's just going to get gigantic. Theirs is in the 25 to 30 foot range. It's literally eating the front of their house. So this is definitely one that goes out on the edge of your property, and you need to have a property that's sized to it a bit, because it is going to end up 10 to 15 feet down at the bottom and another 30 to 40 feet in height. These are purple Daydream Loropetalum from the Southern Living Plant Collection. This is probably the best of the dwarf Loropetalum currently. We've had ours in our garden for 4 years now, and it's 3.5 feet tall and 4 feet wide, and we've had to do nothing to it. I may do a little light pruning on it this spring after it flowers. Gets this frilly flower. It's in the witch hazel family, and it gets that little frilly. Most of the time they're pink. Sometimes white on Loropetalum. This one's almost red. It has an almost red flower. We've paired this with a Miss Lemon Abelia at the house, which is a Variegated Abelia, and it looks really, really good together. Also has some Everillo Carex in the front of it, which is a small grassy-like yellow, grassy-like plant, and it really contrasts well with these purple plants. What I will say, with doing these purple evergreen plants, and we're shooting this in February, and you see this beautiful purple foliage, and then it's gonna flower in a few weeks, and then put on all new, really bright purple foliage the rest of the season. And it has purple all the way down through the plant, which is also new in these purple Loropetalum. They used to just have the purple on the outside and the green in the middle. One thing I'll say is it is good to have some sort of contrasting colors near them, because sometimes these darker colors can get a little lost in our landscapes. But use it in contrast with yellow foliage things, brighter flowering things, white flowers, and then of course shades of green foliage as well. Really make these stand out in the landscape. This is Radiance Abelia. This is a dwarf mounding Abelia, and you can see in this container how compact and how nice that plant actually is. Filming this in February, so you can just imagine how nice it is actually during the growing season. Evergreen, obviously, but zone 6 to 9, zone 6, typically these will thin out a little more in the winter time, and then they'll grow all the way down to zone 9. They'll grow in really, really poor conditions. I mean, up against really hot foundations, really kind of drought-stricken places, really tough spaces. I even see Abelia doing well under shade trees, a little bit thinner, but you know, in part shade and shade conditions where you know, other things just don't want to be around root competition in city spaces and that kind of thing. Blooms all summer long. Doesn't really start blooming until around June, and then it blooms all summer. Pollinators absolutely love them. They're white flowers though against this variegated foliage, and they don't show up all that much. So not calling it a showy flowering plant, but a great flowering shrub for pollinators, and one of the longer blooming shrubs we can have in our gardens. Most flowering shrubs we think of tend to be things that are quick hitters. They come and go pretty quickly, where these, once they get started, they just continue to bloom all summer. Even if it didn't bloom, it wouldn't need to. Look at this. This is the growth habit on this thing. Our Radiance Abelia in our garden are about 2 feet tall and 3 feet wide after 4 years. If I could find a prostrate rosemary or a ground cover rosemary, I'd have it in my ground cover video, but for the most part, most rosemary plants are going to get in that 3 to 4 foot range. With some exceptions, we'll see rosemary as tall as 5 and 6 feet occasionally in the neighborhood. And then there are ones that are much more compact than that. If you can find the Chef's Choice rosemary, we really like it. It will only get maybe 2 to 3 feet in the garden. Then the coolest thing about them is it's February right now, and This is one of the earlier flowering plants. You can see it's a salvia relative, right? It's in that group, similar flowers to salvia. And again, what we see on these is typically when we get the real cold that happens between maybe December 15th and January 15th, that triggers the flowering on these. So as soon as we see a couple of 70-degree days, boom, they come into flower like this. Evergreen, for those of us living in areas where they're cold tolerant, really rich green foliage. Of course, we obviously can use it as an herb, but it doesn't even necessarily, I think it's, I think because we think of it as an herb and we classify it as an herb, we discount it as a landscape plant. And I think it's a great landscape plant because it adds such cool, really interesting texture. This narrow leaf against other things with broader leaves or different foliage colors, different flower timings, all of those kinds of things interact to make a great ornamental garden. And this can be one of those plants in our garden. It does need well-drained soil, so keep that in mind. This is a Mediterranean plant, so it would prefer to not sit in water. But other than that, really easy, from zone, let's say 7B down to 10. And then I love the fact that it's blooming in February. I mean, it's right there with amongst the earliest flowering shrubs for us. Not very often I shoot plants in the winter time, so we can really get to see their winter splendor. This is Fire Chief Arborvitae from the Southern Living Plant Collection. This one's really interesting because it turns this rust color during the winter time that's really quite vibrant. I don't know how well it'll show up here in the camera. And then as fast as it did this, as soon as the soil temperature hits maybe 60, 65 degrees, it'll flip really quickly. And it has this very vibrant, almost yellowish, I don't want to describe, yellowish orange new growth on it during the growing season that's contrasted by this kind of lime green color that's always down in the bottom of it. That's part that's protected from the cold, still maintains this green during the winter time. This color will show up differently in different winters. So we've actually had real winter here. I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina, shooting this. And if you bring this above the ground and you have the roots exposed, you're basically one zone colder or so than we are. And then add to that we've actually had some actual cold this winter. They've actually fully colored up. So for us in the South, this may not put on quite this much color on a year-to-year basis, but what it does anyway, it'll just stay like this. So, you're not gonna lose either way. Great low mounding plant. You can keep this one anywhere between 2 to 4 feet in height, 2 to 4 feet in width. If you just let it go and let it become a ball over time, it'll go through 4 by 4, something like that. Soft textured, so it's not not prickly if you have to get in there and prune it or do any weeding around it or anything like that. But I thought I'd show off the winter color on it. I've got full video on the channel for this plant. And it's got a lot of great uses, but in the winter time, it turns this really cool, like fire engine color. I don't really know I don't know what this color is called. Orange rust color, but it's super vibrant. Some of these rust colors that happen on some of these conifers are uninteresting or look like the plant is declining in some way. And this one actually just shows off when it fully colors up. This is Angelica Blue Juniper. This is not one I've actually covered on the channel before. It is one that I grew at my nursery occasionally. You can see this blue coloration in it. Shooting this in February, and it will have a much more bluer hue when all the new growth is coming out on it during the spring. But you can see the late season growth from last year still has that color in it. And then it has a slightly darker green color down in the plant. This one's kind of interesting because where would you grow this? This is going to get 5 feet tall and 10 feet wide, right? So there's not a whole lot of places for those dimensions of a plant. But folks do have banks and slopes where we can need to grow things on to stabilize the banks in place. It's going to be extremely drought tolerant. What I think of when I think of these junipers that get into that 4 to 5 foot range is I think about them using them as layers, where you can have the taller juniper up toward the top of the bank, and then you can layer down with lower ground covers as you get lower on the bank. So, and as you need to change from things that need it dry, because typically the top of a bank is going to be dry, as you get lower on the bank, you may need things that will take slightly wetter feet, and these junipers don't really particularly like wet feet. So that's my idea of layering this type of plant on a slope or a bank for folks who need that kind of thing. It's a low hedging size, so we could keep this narrower if we wanted to. We could probably and you can see how these have actually been pruned here. You know, you can actually box these off on the sides and allow them to get taller, or you could box them off on the top and allow and keep them more ground cover like. So that's up to you. But if you were to just leave them alone, it's really a really vibrant blue color during the growing season that is super heat tolerant and drought tolerant, and again can be layered on a bank to give you some size differentiation and not just some, instead of trying to answer an entire problem with just one particular plant. This is one we've covered several times on the channel over the years. This is all gold juniper. It's a shore juniper. Blue Pacific is one that you may know that has a bluish hue to it and grows very similar to all gold. But we really love all gold. This is a show off in the garden. And where I'm talking about maybe layering in this ground cover, you know, when I'm talking about ground covers, doing different sizes and different, you know, this allows you to have a really flat growing plant. This one's less than a foot tall and just as wide as you want to let it get ultimately. You can control the width, however you want to control the width. This one's going to be less than a foot tall. You could use something like Sargent's juniper behind it that stays green year round, that gets 1 to 2 feet tall. So it would contrast with it in size slightly and in color, and really allow the chartreuse color to pop on all gold. But we really love this plant. You know, full sun really shines. And then in the winter time, I found this plant really interesting because when the sun is on a low trajectory in the winter time, any side that the sun is striking stays really yellow and the other side loses a little bit of its color. It all ends up super bright during the summertime, but I've noticed this plant, if you were really thinking about orienting it toward the south, it really gets this crazy gold hue on it during the wintertime. Here's some amethyst Encore Azalea, or autumn amethyst Encore Azalea. You can see this flower is described as purple, but it's kind of a pinkish purple. Very heavy flowering variety. This one's been one of the top sellers in the Encore brand forever, and there's a reason for it, because it blooms heavily. It very reliably blooms heavily. It's a zone 6 variety, so some of the Encores are zone 7 to 10, you'll notice, and some of them are zone 6 to 10. And I think you can go over on the website and see the ones that are the cold hardy selections for zone 6. One other thing about this plant is you'll notice I'm filming it in February and it is purple like this in the winter time. It takes on this really beautiful purple hue, and in a mass planting like this, it's really quite spectacular. Of course, it'll bloom in the spring and then it will repeat bloom in the fall with some flowers in the summer, depending on where you are. The further south you are, the more likely you are to get 3 times flowering on these Encore Azaleas. But this one has been, again, I think it's right at the top of the sales pretty much every year for Encore, because it's really compact habit. I will call this one a medium-sized grower. It'll get 4x4 if you just let it, but it can be kept smaller than that. So you can prune these after the spring flowering heavily, and then you want to leave them, and then you can leave them alone after that, and they'll flush back out and bloom again in the fall. But I've never filmed this variety in February in a group like this with all that purple foliage on it. I think it's beautiful, but it'll come as the soil temperature warms up, these leaves will go right back to that rich dark green color, and then they'll cover up in flowers in March and April. This is a Podocarpus macrophyllus called Emerald Flame. I think Ted Stevens was one of the first people who brought this back from Japan. It has pink new growth on it. So I'm filming this in February, and you can see the great texture of this plant. This is going to be a good screening plant in part shade conditions or sunny conditions, and reach somewhere between 8 and 10 feet in height. You know, some of the other Podocarpus like Mackie tend to be a little more vigorously upright and can get taller than that. But this one is similar to the one we have Mood Ring at the house, where this one has a pink new growth on it. It's kind of a burgundy-ish. It kind of goes through changeable colors on its way to this solid green. Of course, in the wintertime, as you can see, it's green like this. And again, we have that one at the house called Mood Ring that's in the Southern Living Plant Collection. It has a similar habit where they're going to be ultimately upright and pretty narrow and reach somewhere in the 8 to 10 foot range. But great plant, great textured plant. Here in the South, we don't have a lot of conifers that are really tough in the South, and this is a good example of one that is. May take a minute with this one, where Mackie and a couple others are just more initially rigidly upright. This Emerald Flame and the other one that we have, the Mood Ring, tend to be a little bit leggy on the way. I mean, not leggy, but kind of wispy on the way to ultimately being a very upright plant. A lot of times when we're shopping for Aucubas, you'll see just solid green ones, and then you'll see gold dust available. Not a lot of other selections, but there are a ton of named ones out in the world that are super, super interesting, and we have covered several on the channel over the years. This one's called Golden King. Great name for it. Quite a bit more yellow in this one than there is in gold dust. What a great looking plant. Of course, these are for part shade or shade conditions. You can keep these pretty much any size you want to keep them. Ultimately, most of these will creep up. These gold foliage plants are slower growing, or chartreuse colored plants are slower growing, but ultimately it can creep up over 6 feet in height, but can be kept more like 3 to 4 feet in height if you want to do that. But what a great plant. Those shady spaces that have those long shadows in the fall and in the spring, these are the type of plants that really, really stand out. And if you can find plants that contrast with foliage type, you know, look at those two together. This is a podocarpus, a macrophyllus with a gold Aucuba. This is one of our absolute favorite low doming evergreen shrubs. This is Mojo Pittosporum. We have 4 of these in our garden in Raleigh, and we have one of everything. So if we have more than one of something, you know, we definitely like it. Love this plant for part shade or shade conditions. This variegation is changeable during the season. So the oldest growth is because it's off-white variegation, but when it's actively growing, the variegation is more of a gold on green. It does flower. It gets a fragrant flower down inside the shrub that you'll smell. Probably takes a few years on these dwarf ones to get to the point where they're going to flower. Again, flower's insignificant, but you'll smell it. But we really love this just for its evergreen, low doming habit. We have 3 of them together in one spot that are covering about 9-10 square feet. We don't have to weed, don't have to think about. It's not much taller than it is in this container right here. It's probably less than 2 feet in height and probably 3.5 feet in width, and 4 years in the ground without having to do any pruning on them. This is a group of firepower Nandinas. You can see why it might be called firepower, although these are indoors in a greenhouse in the wintertime, and so they haven't colored up as much as they would have if they were fully outside in the direct sun. This little shade cloth cover is keeping them from fully covering up. It's keeping them warm, and there's really not enough probably direct sun on them really to also get that color. But this is a Nandina that's green during the summer. Well, when it's actively growing, it has a little bit of reddish color on it too, but then settles into green, and then in the winter turns this vibrant, like fire engine red color for the winter time. I will say that blush Nandina is very similar to this one, where it turns red in the winter, but then blush also has this blush pink new growth during the spring and summer that might add some additional seasonality to this plant. If you're deciding between the 2 of them, they'll look very similar on a table during the winter time. But blush pink really stands out during the spring. Where we think of Nandinas as being invasive, these are not, so we don't have to worry about that. They're, you know, really, really tame, perfect little ornamental horticulture plants, because what you see is what you get. These will get 3 feet tall, maybe as much as 4 feet tall, but typically more like 3 feet tall, and they'll slightly colonize a little bit over the years. That place where I used to get my cuttings from, where I was cutting the top of them all the time, they had colonized a little bit, but even that was still taking up a very small space overall. So this is one of those plant and forget it kind of plants, planted in the full sun, planted on tough foundation conditions, west side of your house where nothing else will seem to survive in that afternoon heat against your brick foundation. This is the kind of plant that will tolerate that. Here's a crop of gold dust Aucuba, another great part shade or shade shrub. Gold dust tends to be more on the green side with some gold speckling, and you'll get some variation in this where you may see a center yellow stripe in it, or, you know, again, you'll see the occasional branch that's quite a bit brighter. They tend to be a little bit variable in time. You can let these get 6 or 8 feet in height in time, or you can keep them 3 to 4 feet in height. Totally up to you on how you handle these. They are moist, well-drained conditions is kind of ideal for Aucuba, but they will take dry shade, which is a nice thing. And if you go to the Asian garden at Ralston Arboretum, you can see tons of different variegations and non-variegated Aucuba in that space, and you know, I've always loved Aucuba. Again, though, gold dust tends to be one of the more common ones you'll find at retail, but more and more we're seeing some that have brighter variegations, more chartreuse color in them, some that almost look almost completely yellow with just a spotting of green, rather than, you know, green with the spotting of yellow. But really versatile plant for our shade and part shade areas. Sometimes you'll see this is deer resistant, and I made the mistake of saying that on a video in the past, but lots of people have deer just mow these down. So I would not put it in the deer resistant category. There are a few named varieties out on the market for these Arizona cypress. This is Carolina Sapphire, might be the most common of them. It has a really nice it ends up being a really perfect Christmas tree, but it has kind of a softer look to it than blue ice, and which is the other pretty common one out on the market. These have an interesting odor when you disturb the foliage on them. Deer typically don't eat them, but I've said that before, and then a couple people said that deer did mess with theirs. So you know, I sometimes avoid saying that altogether because everybody's deer are different. These are very fast growing. This is a new crop, so these 7 gallons they'll grow 2 feet in these containers in the next few months. As we're shooting this in February, just April, and these will really get going. These are native to the Southwest United States, and you would think that a lot of those Southwestern native plants wouldn't like our conditions, our humid, you know, rainy conditions here in the Southeast United States, but that's the opposite. These things just grow like crazy. We see the North Carolina Department of Transportation using these on the side of the interstate because they're so drought tolerant, but then they also tolerate those wetter conditions that we can get occasionally. Again, soft to the touch, interesting foliage smell, beautiful blue-green color like this. And this is February, so it doesn't change color in the winter time. It kind of keeps the color year-round, where a lot of conifers can be changeable seasonally in, you know, how they look, from green to rusty colors and that kind of thing. But this would be great in any kind of mixed border screen, but you got to have some room. This is a 50-foot tall thing that's, you know, ultimately going to be 15 feet wide. We've got a neighbor that planted one in front of their house, and it's just literally eating the front of their house. So probably not a great corner foundation plant, and more of a slightly larger lot screening plant. This is a blueberry from the Southern Living Plant Collection. This one's called Hello Darlin'. Really like this variety. It's once it flowers in the spring, it's very quick from a pollinator coming along and pollinating it to a finished fruit. And I think that's important when we're trying to grow fruit in our gardens, that, you know, sometimes it takes from the time a peach flowers until that peach is ready, or that apple or whatever, is months and months and months and months. And the longer it's on the tree, the more things that can go wrong from the point it flowered until it finished, right? This variety's got a very short window between flower and fruit, and quicker than a lot. One of the things I want to point out is how filming this in February in South Georgia, and they're starting to bloom a little bit later at our house in Raleigh. They'll be blooming mid-March, something like that. They get these little dangling white flowers on them that are super attractive. Pollinators absolutely love. But then, you know, for us in the South, they don't go completely dormant, and they leave some of these purple leaves on through the winter time, which are quite attractive. And even if they go completely deciduous, as the bark gets older on older plants, it starts to be super interesting. So even, you know, it's a winter interest plant. You wouldn't even really think about that, but I consider blueberries to be kind of 4-season plants, and to give us obviously these flowers, but it also gives us great fall color. In the deeper South, the leaves tend to stay on through the winter time in this purple, you know, as this purple plant. And then it has the stems from the last year's growth are kind of a reddish purple as well. And again, in this group like this, it's a real standout in a February, you know, in the garden for us in Raleigh. So just pointing out that we think about blueberries, of course, as love the fruit, and we're trying to get them to fruit, but they're also, I think, great ornamental plants. This is a Christmas jewel holly from the Southern Living Plant Collection. We have this one in our garden in Raleigh, but we actually had it in a container for like 3 or 4 years. Really great, upright growing holly. It will get a little broader in time if you let it, but you can shear this one pretty narrow. Flowers, as you would expect in the late winter, early spring. Pollinators go, come in, pollinate them, and then you get this berry set on this variety. It's just wild how many berries you actually get on here. We're filming this in February, and this is kind of the overlap season for these hollies, where this year's flowers are starting to form, but last year's flowers are still, present on the plant with the, in the form of that red fruit there. That's Christmas Jewel has a narrower leaf than some of the other broadleaf hollies. It's kind of akin to, Foster Eye, or Foster number 2 that we used to grow quite a bit. Foster had a slightly longer leaf than this, but a similar growth habit. It looks wicked, like you see all these points on the leaves, but they're very muted. So a lot of this breeding in these hollies now is to make these, they don't fight back as much if you have to go and do any pruning on them or anything like that. But this was a great container plant for us for 4 years as a little Christmas tree shaped, holly in a container. And then of course it's a great corner foundation plant. And then of course any kind of mixed border screen. You could control the height and width on this one about any way you'd want to. It's not as vigorously upright as some of the other upright hollies are. So it would be easy to control this one. If you wanted it to reach 6 feet and just hold it there, you could absolutely do that. But this is a Christmas Jewel holly. This is an Italian cypress, and this is the way they grow. This is a Mediterranean plant we think of. We think of Mediterranean plants as things like rosemary and other plants that like to be in fairly arid conditions, fairly dry conditions, definitely drying out between rains and waterings and that kind of thing. And so we'll see tons of Italian cypress as we get out west. Once you get past the middle Texas and down into the desert Southwest, you see them just all over the place growing, because it's an easy plant for them to grow, and doesn't have to adapt to that climate, that Mediterranean climate of California. But then they do perfectly fine in the Southeast as well. And if you followed our channel, when we go down to Ram and Tom Giberson's garden, she's got a couple of paths there framed in these big, beautiful Italian cypress that she's, probably had in the ground for a couple of decades now. Not the fastest growing thing in the world, but ultimately will end up 40, 50, 60 feet in height, something like that, and still only, this big around, when it gets to that height. Make sure you're selecting one that's pretty rigidly upright when you're planting them. If you're in an area that can be exposed to wind, you may need to do a little bit of staking on them early on. But really, really great plants. Not a plant you're going to put in a wet space. So as soon as you hear Mediterranean plant about any plant, you immediately know if you're trying to grow that thing in the Southeast, it's not going to like to stay wet between rains and watering. So put it in an area that dries out, in between rain events, and definitely worth a shot. Not everybody in the Southeast with our rain and humidity is going to be able to grow them, but maybe you have a spot. And when you see one of these, they're just unique in every way. And you can, when you're driving around an area where a lot of them are planted, you can see them over the houses, in the distance all over the place. And it is truly, truly a unique plant. Okay. This is Bronze Beauty Cleara from the Southern Living Plant Collection. The Southern Living Plant Collection has I don't know how many there are, probably 5, I may be off on that number, Cleara in the collection. And they do they're for various things. That Bronze Beauty has probably one of the medium-sized growers. Medium size in a Cleara is probably going to be 12 to 15 feet in height, something like that. We have Leanne and what is the other one that we have on the edge over there? Bigfoot in our garden in Raleigh. And Leanne probably stays the smallest. Again, Bronze Beauty somewhere in the middle. Bigfoot, the name is appropriate for one that's going to get big, big, big. It turns this, with the winter color on it that you were seeing up close at the beginning, is kind of a purpley bronze color. But then as the new growth starts on these, we're shooting this at the end of February. These are kind of small 3-gallon plants right now. They will grow like mad, really can grow 2 or 3 feet in a single season pretty quickly. And all the new growth on it as it's coming out from that is this bronze color. And it really has this incredible two-tone coloration on it with the old green foliage. Then after that hardens off a bit, if you want to, in the early summer, you can go out and shear these a bit. They don't require shearing to stay full as screening plants, but they can be sheared, and that will produce a new round of color on them. And that's what we do on our Juliet Cleara at the house, because it also has beautiful new color on it, is we can just give it an extra shearing, and that creates more of that. But if you're looking for pretty fast growing screening plant that's not going to get 20 or 25 feet tall, kind of a medium sized screening plant, Bronze Beauty Cleara is a good one. Here's a crop of fairly newly planted Globosonana Cryptomeria. This is a dwarf roundish growing Cryptomeria, although it can creep up to 6 feet in height in time. It's easy to keep this one 3 to 4 feet in height and 3 to 4 feet in width, something like that. Great foundation plant. I think this was a really tough southern conifer too. I'm in Florida filming this, and so we don't have a tremendous amount of conifers that do really well in the southeast, especially when you're this far south. But Cryptomeria or Japanese cedars are in that group. There are Japanese cedars that get 80 feet tall and Japanese cedars that get a foot tall. And this one is a dwarf one, again, though, that will, you know, I think a lot of people are going to plant this and want to keep it about 3 feet in height. If you don't prune it, it's going to just keep adding because it doesn't read the tag, and it's just going to keep growing up and about equally as wide as tall. So if it's 3 feet tall, it's going to be 3 feet wide. This thing grows. They don't have to prune these at all. It's just a matter of rooting them, potting them, and waiting, because they'll fill in any direction that they're not full already and just become a perfect round ball, basically. Really great. This is a really great plant, but for folks that want something that's neat looking all the time, and wanting something that will give a different texture, you know, to leafy evergreens and other flowering things, and then something that's the same year round. These will turn in colder areas. You'll get a little bit of bronzing on them during the winter time, but they resist it more than a lot of other conifers and typically stay more green, like this one is, you know, as we're filming this in February. But Globosonana, great plant. And again, I think it works really well in those folks that want something that's year round, kind of the same. And then they can, in front of that, do things that maybe go to sleep or go to ground in the wintertime or lose their leaves or whatever. This is a plant I don't know if I've ever talked about on the channel. This is Asiatic Jasmine. You'll see green foliage, Asiatic Jasmine, and now lots and lots of new variegated ones out on the market. And the variegated ones tend to be changeable during the growing season to where the new growth is kind of pink, and then they'll settle into these variegated, you know, whitish and off-white leaves, and then it'll settle in the oldest growth into green. So it creates this kind of layered, multicolored ground cover. And I think there's one called Snow in Summer that's become very, very popular. That may be what this is. It's not labeled here. And these are small, newly planted containers. So this isn't particularly, you know, the best advertisement for this plant. But we see this plant being used in really difficult shade conditions in our neighborhood where it's well drained. We'll see this on a slope down to the street if somebody's house is kind of elevated above the street and they're got kind of a shady bank. Kind of perfect conditions for that. We'll see these growing under trees at the Ralston Arboretum where, you know, really, you know, some maple planted in a contained space, and there's just nothing else would grow under it. These Asiatic Jasmine do well in those conditions. They're hardy in zone 7 to 9. They're evergreen, and you know, one thing I'll say is, like any other ground cover, you know, this could get bigger than you want at some point. So you'll want to put it in an area maybe where you'll have some check or control on it. Like, don't plant them next to the woods next to your house, you know, plant it out by the street. If you had a shady hell strip area between the curb and the sidewalk at your house or something like that, that's where they're being used effectively in our neighborhood in Raleigh, where it's just super, super tough conditions in the shade. We're at a wholesale nursery in Florida called Tropical Traditions. It's one of my favorite nurseries to visit, and the owner's just really has become a friend in time here. This is a beautiful crop of soft caress Mahonia at his place. This is a soft, very super soft textured Mahonia. We tend to think of Mahonia as being, you know, very pokey and very invasive, and, you know, some issues with, you know, Asian species of Mahonias in our gardens. This one kind of bucks all of those things. It has kind of a interesting blue-green, soft textured foliage, and I just love using this plant we've been using one as a container plant for several years, or they can go in the ground in part shade or shade conditions. They bloom in the winter time, so we're filming this in February, and I can see where the flower spikes were on them before. Down here in Florida, they're already starting to put on some spring growth, but about as tall as I've seen these, about 3.5 to 4 feet, and equally as wide, something like that, in time. Really, one of the things I love, a lot of our shade evergreen shrubs that we use in the South tend to have very large leaves on them. You know, you'll see that in a lot of shade plants. So putting something next to that with this soft texture, really, that combination really pops in the garden. This is blush pink Nandina, which is interesting because it turns red, fire engine red in the wintertime, just like firepower Nandina does. It has a similar leaf. It's not invasive, same as firepower. But it has an extra bonus to it. So after, we're in a greenhouse, and back we're in the warmer part of the greenhouse here, they've already started putting on new growth for the season, and they've lost the winter red color. The ones out near the door where it's a little colder still have the red coloration in them. But they'll go from this red color, they'll green back up, and then this new flush of growth will come out of them that's pink, and that's why it's called blush pink. And so it takes firepower Nandina, which we all love for this fire engine red color in the wintertime. They're like beacons in the landscape in the wintertime. And it turns it into more of a 4-season plant. Instead of just being red or green, it's red or green or pink, just always doing something out in the landscape. So I really like this plant. It's such a well-behaved, ornamental plant. No maintenance to it. Again, it's not an invasive Nandina, and it just kind of plays nice in the landscape. Becomes incredibly drought tolerant in time, and it just changes what it's doing several times during the year to basically impress you again. So that's a blush pink Nandina. This is Touch of Gold Holly from the Southern Living Plant Collection. This is a gold Hugendorn holly, which is kind of interesting because I've always thought Hugendorn was kind of the toughest of the low-growing Japanese holly. So in comparison to Soft Touch Holly or Hellerai Holly, Hugendorn's just a better overall holly. For some reason, it's just never been as mass-produced as Hellerai or Soft Touch. And then this is a gold version of it. So all the new growth on this throughout the season has this bright gold color. A lot of the growers will grow these under a little bit of shade cloth. They tend to do a little better in the nursery under a little bit of shade cloth, and then they won't have quite as much gold on them. So this one's not quite as gold as it will be, but they've just pulled the shade cloth off here at this nursery. And as soon as they pull the shade cloth off and it's in the full sun, it just immediately turns completely chartreuse. It's just really wild, and it's kind of transitioning in the middle of those that color change now, just because, again, the way they grow. A lot of plants are grown in shade that need sun in the garden, or grown in the sun and need shade in the garden, whatever, back and forth. But this is a gold Hugendorn holly called Touch of Gold. This is Aucuba japonica Hosuba-Hosu, a very brightly colored variegated Aucuba japonica. Has elongated leaves and bright yellow spotting throughout the entire plant. This is truly a 4-season plant. Best in part shade to shade conditions in moist, kind of well-drained soil, but it will become very drought tolerant in time. These are hardy in zone 7 to 9. If you live in zone 7, I would put it in an area out of the west wind and the north wind because it can get a little winter burn on it during the winter time. Extremely low maintenance plant. It can reach 4 to 6 feet in height, maybe 4 feet in width. A little bit of tip pruning on it if it's, a branch is going here or there, but overall really doesn't need a lot of pruning. We keep it well mulched, keep the weeds away from it. We fertilize it in the late winter, and that's about all we do on this amazing shade evergreen shrub. Great foundation plant, great accent plant, great mass planted. Again, great in a woodland garden, great in dry shade. Really a lot of uses for this shade evergreen, very brightly colored Hosuba-Hosu Aucuba japonica. This is Buxus sempervirens Oreo variegata, otherwise known as variegated boxwood. I'm actually limbing this one up into a little 1-ball topiary. I got another 2-ball topiary over on the other side of the garden, but typically this is a either kept as a low mounding shrub or just allowed to grow in time. It can ultimately get about 10 feet in height and 6, 7, 8 feet in width, something like that if you just let it. But most people are going to control these as kind of low hedges or specimen plants, or have them growing in containers or topiary them, and all the other things that we can do with boxwoods. Typically we're going to have these, boxwoods in full sun, but I would not shy away from having this in partial shade. It really brightens up a shady spot, or a spot where you have long shadows in the garden. Incredibly low maintenance, deer resistant, rabbit resistant, a lot of the things that we look for in a garden plant. They're pH adaptable, so lots of different types of soil types that they can take. Great in sandy soils, great in clay soils, but I do mound them up a bit. Boxwoods tend to be a little shallow rooted, so I keep them mulched well here in the garden, so don't let the sun just beat down on those roots. We got the weeds away from it and that kind of thing. They're hardy in zone 6 to 8, a little less hardy overall with this variegation than some of the just straight green boxwoods. When it starts to grow in the spring, the variegation is kind of a bright white edge to it. And then as the season goes on, that bright white settles into kind of a slightly off yellow color on the variegation, filming this between Christmas and New Year's. And you can see what a bright pop of color this is here in our Raleigh, North Carolina garden. But I really love these variegated boxwoods because they're so low maintenance, but they give you this incredible pop of color here in the garden 12 months out of the year. This is Cameocypris obtusa Shiraman, or Shiraman Hinoki cypress. Really interesting, upright, fastigiate growing Hinoki cypress that has this really crazy crinkly growth on it. Kind of considered a slow grower, but for us it's actually put on about a foot of growth the first year it was in the ground. You'll see this listed at maybe 4 feet tall and 2 feet wide, but ultimately it's going to get bigger. The plants don't read the tags, and so I've seen it 6, 7 feet in the ground before, and I think it'll probably would grow 10 feet and 3 feet wide if you just let it. But it could be, you could do some controlled pruning on it. Really super low maintenance plant, great specimen plant, can be bonsai'd, so you can take and manipulate this plant all over the place if you wanted to. Really extremely low maintenance. Likes well-drained soil, so make sure it's in an area that's okay if it stays moist, but definitely not wet. That would be a bad idea. More sun the better. Hardy in zone 4 or 5 to zone 8. Zone 4, 5, 6, 7, more sun the better. I'm in zone 8 with this thing, and we have it in a space where it's getting some afternoon shade. So it's full sun in the morning till midday, and then we have it in late day shade. So as you're in hotter and hotter areas, a little late day shade's probably ideal for this plant. Very, very low maintenance. We're fertilizing it once in the late winter with an organic fertilizer, and that's pretty much it. If it had a crazy limb on it, I could cut it off whatever time of the year, really. If I needed to do general pruning on it, I'd do that in the late winter. Deer resistant, rabbit resistant. Just a great focal point piece. Would also work great as a container plant, as a really a thriller in the middle of a container with other things planted around it, and it can stay in that container pretty much year-round. So it's great year-round interest from this Shiraman Hinoki cypress. This is Cryptomeria japonica dragon prince from the Southern Living Plant Collection. This is an incredible, super compact, ornamental conifer that can be kept between 2 to 3 feet in height, maybe 3 to 4 feet in width in time. This one has been in the ground for about 4 years. It's never been pruned. It's only been fertilized once a year with an organic fertilizer back in February, March every year. Don't have to lay a blade on it to keep it just this really beautiful, compact dome shape that it has. When it's initially leafing out in the spring, or new foliage is coming on it in the spring, it has kind of a limey green color to it, and then it settles into this really great darker green color. Like other Cryptomeria, it's fine textured and it's pretty soft to the touch. Other conifers will kind of bite you back if you're messing around with them. So another reason it makes a great ornamental. This is a great plant for low foundations, great plant for containers. They're hardy in zone 6 to 9. And if you're in zone 6, I'd put it in a slightly protected space in a 6A for sure. The rest of us can use it wherever we want to in the garden, but really a very versatile plant for low foundations, accent plant, really great mixed with other types of texture, other leaf colors, other textures in the garden, and just one of my favorite ornamental plants because it's been in the ground 4 years. It looks like this, and we've done nothing to it. So again, this is Dragon Prince Cryptomeria. This is Highlights Arborvitae from the Southern Living Plant Collection, or Thuja occidentalis Highlights. This is an Eastern Arborvitae that has this amazing new chartreuse foliage on it and incredibly resist burning even in warmer areas or bleaching. A lot of times these chartreuse color or lime green colored new growth conifers, during the heat of the summer, they tend to bleach a bit. And I'm filming this right at the beginning of October. And this thing has gone through an entire, now 3 seasons in pretty tough conditions, 10 hours of direct sun on it here in Zone 8A in Raleigh, North Carolina, without bleaching, and just looking fantastic here in the garden. These are hardy in Zone 5 to 8, but probably more cold hardy than that, probably more like zones 4 to 8. More sun, the more fuller the plant is. It has this upright, narrow habit on it, but we do keep the ground well mulched. We're making sure we're watering our conifers in abnormally dry times, because they're not great at letting us know that they're dry. And so we're making sure if we water it, we're thoroughly watering it and then letting it drain out. This one again is an upright, narrow growing habit. Thuja occidentalis can be sheared into boxwood-like plants, really. So you could keep this 6 to 8 feet in height permanently if you wanted to, by shearing it once a year in the late winter a bit to keep it that size. But if you just let it go, this one's probably going to reach 20 feet in height, maybe 4 or 5 feet in width. Really great corner foundation plant, good container plant for a few years. Great in a mixed border. I typically recommend using different types of plants to create your screen from your neighbor, just in case any plant in your screen has a problem, you don't lose your entire screen. But really great ornamental plant. We have found it to be incredibly sun tolerant and heat tolerant here in our southern garden, and look forward to it growing the rest of the way up the corner foundation in the future. Juliet Cleara from the Southern Living Plant Collection, one of our favorite go-to evergreen shrubs. This one leafs out with kind of a maroon foliage during the growing season, during spring and early summer, and then they develop into these variegated creamy white and dark green leaves that looks like every single leaf is individually painted. It's really a very, very striking plant. These will reach something like 8 to 10 feet in height, maybe 4 to 6 feet in width, something like that. You can control it at kind of whatever size you want. Great in a mixed border, mixed hedge, that kind of thing. If you put some darker green things with it, it makes this variegation stand out even more. These are hardy in zone 7 to 10. Moderate to slower growth than some of its green counterparts. These variegated plants are somewhat slower. Full sun is best, and that will keep it its fullest. We've got this one in part shade, and we have to do the occasional little bit of pruning on it because it's trying to stretch on us just a bit. But again, this is a great 4-season plant for anyone's garden. It likes well-drained conditions, so don't put it in a wet space. This is Juliet Cleara. This is Marvel Mahonia from the Southern Living Plant Collection. This is a great plant if you have a part shade or shade area where you have root competition or dry shade. This is a really fantastic plant for those types of conditions. It'll take whatever shade conditions, but this one is one that you can put in the ground and really feel confident that it can hold up around existing tree roots and shady conditions. Marvel will reach about 6 feet in height, maybe 3 to 4 feet in width, something like that. Maybe a hair bigger than that in the future. This thing, winter flowers with these extremely large candles of yellow flowers that sometimes will, for us, I'm in zone 8 in Raleigh, North Carolina. These are hardy in zone 6 to 9. Sometimes for us, we'll get a little bit of cool weather in the fall and they'll actually bloom kind of before Christmas with a couple of them, and then after mid-January, late January, we'll see some additional flowers on it. So it kind of comes into flower, slows down in the peak of the winter, and then comes back into flower later. These are some spent flowers from last year. Virtually no maintenance with this plant. There is you can prune this after it flowers in the early spring, and you can actually cut these canes. I pulled a leaf off. You can actually cut these canes all the way down to the ground if you want to, or you can cut them down to whatever height. You can go across the top of the plant and cut it to the height you want, and it'll come back out and grow maybe 2 feet during the growing season. Or if it's gotten wider than you want, you can just cut the thing right down to the ground, or individual canes to narrow it in some. Has this beautiful lustrous green foliage. It is a little spiky, you know, so, you know, wear some gloves if you're having to prune it, but typically you're not gonna have to do any pruning on it. The pollinators go crazy for these flowers in the winter time. So when it's, you know, at a time of year that there's not a lot of flowering things out here, this is fantastic for your native bees and honeybees as well. Deer resistant, rabbit resistant, just kind of a really industrial kind of plant with beauty and flowering at an odd time of year that can hold up in some of those dry shade conditions people struggle with. This is Miss Lemon Abelia from the Southern Living Plant Collection. This is a low doming, evergreen, variegated shrub that is fantastic for pollinators. It has a yellow and green variegation. The yellow will become kind of an off-white color in time as the leaves age on it. All the new growth is just really bright and showy during the growing season. They're hardy in zone 6 to 9. They're kind of semi-evergreen in zone 6, fully evergreen down in zone 9. These reach about 3 feet in height, about 4 feet in width. They're deer resistant, insect resistant, rabbit resistant, fantastic drought tolerant, low doming shrubs. Pollinators absolutely love these. They'll start flowering sometime around June and bloom literally all summer long. Just a great choice for a low doming evergreen plant. If you have a low foundation in a sunny space, perfect plant for you. This is Mountain Snow Pieris from the Southern Living Plant Collection, a great plant for 12 months of the year interest. These have new growth in the early spring. It has a burgundy color to it, and all the time it's growing, it has that coloration on the new growth. Then those leaves mature and become a really rich dark green. Sometime toward the end of summer, it forms these little racemes or little hanging stalks off the plant that have the flower buds on them, and gives you this anticipation all through fall toward the end of winter of these beautiful white flowers that emerge as soon as the soil temperature starts to warm up. They're pendulous, hanging down on the plant, and quite fragrant. This is a very striking plant. This is deer resistant, rabbit resistant, drought tolerant once established. Best in the part shade, great part shade foundation plant, great in a big cluster, 3 or 5 or 7 in a part shade or darker place in the landscape where these white flowers will really show off. One of my favorite industrial evergreen shrubs that has these showy fragrant flowers on it. This is Mountain Snow Pieris. This is Green Penguin Scots Pine, or Pinus sylvestris green penguin. It was found as a selection of seedlings of Pinus sylvestris. This is native to Scotland and then Norway, Sweden, that area of the world. So it's extremely cold tolerant. Hardy in zones 3 to 7, but we are in zone 8 in Raleigh, and we've just kind of used some living mulch to keep the roots cool during the summer. It needs full sun, but this is one of the lowest maintenance plants in our Raleigh garden, and we've used it as kind of an entryway piece into the garden because it's so interesting. It kind of has this little penguin shape to it. 10 years, it'll be 4 or 5 feet in height, but super narrow. Again, if you're growing it in warmer areas, I would definitely make sure it's well mulched at a minimum, because it does need the more sun the better, full sun ideally. But in warmer areas, I would encourage you to put, some sort, we've got this variegated sedum on one side and this annual vinca on the other to keep the roots cool on it, because this one's getting 8-10 hours of direct sun every day during the summer. It'll grow about 3 to 5 inches a year. Really tolerant of a lot of soil types, but not tolerant of wet feet at all. So mound it up a bit when you plant it, or plant it on a bit of a slope. If you're putting it as a container plant, which it's a great choice for a container, make sure it's a really well-draining soil mix. And outside of that, this is a really great plant to add something unique into your garden that most people won't recognize, but they'll definitely want to know what it is. This is Green Penguin Pine. This is Fatsia japonica spider's web from the Southern Living Plant Collection. This has beautiful changeable variegated leaves throughout the season. Some are speckled, some are striped, some are just kind of beautiful versions of variegated large palmate leaves. This is an evergreen. This is a shade plant. They're hardy in zone 8 to 10. Here we are in zone 7B in Raleigh, North Carolina, and we've got it tucked up against the house that needs to be in a protected space to grow it in zone 7 for sure. This thing flowers in the fall with these kind of almost alien looking spherical white flower clusters that the pollinators absolutely love. They eventually become black berries. Again, this is a shade evergreen that likes moist, well-drained conditions. Very pest resistant. We keep it mulched, we keep the weeds away from it, we fertilize it in the late winter. We really don't ever need to prune this plant. It'll reach about 4 to 5 feet in height and about 3 to 4 feet in width. Easy, easy plant, Spider's Web Fatsia. This is Frankie Boy Arborvitae, or you'll see it listed as Thuja orientalis or Platycatus orientalis is the Latin names for it. This was a seed selection from Austria, normally with Thuja orientalis. You'll see like it's basically little plates surrounding on the outside. It's really interesting growth habit these have, but this one has this like filament style growth, right, in this weeping form. It's really quite striking. It's got yellow new growth that kind of settles into a chartreuse green in the center. Frequently, you would purchase this as a really tight form. There's a lot of pruning that normally goes into these to keep them really tight and compact. But we just like this kind of free form look that it has. I like the red stems on it. I like being able to see it. That little bit of extra pruning though, if you are keeping it in that tighter habit, will probably encourage some additional growth. So you'll see more of this yellow on it throughout the year. Great 12-month plant. I like it in this loose form because it kind of blows around in the wind a bit. Ultimately, it'll reach about 6 feet tall in 15 to 20 years, something like that. 10 to 15 years, let's say 6 feet tall, 4 feet wide. I could shear it much closer than that. These Asian species of Arborvitae tend to be more heat tolerant. So this is hardy in zone 5 to 9, where you may see like our native Eastern Arborvitae being hardy in 3 to 7 or 3 to 8. So much more heat tolerant, and then definitely full sun. Full sun's going to give you the most color, and these really hold up well in the full sun, even in the south. So this one's getting 8-9 hours of direct sun. We keep the weeds away from it. It's in well-drained soil. We keep it mulched, water it when it becomes abnormally dry. And this is a really great plant that's so interesting, and not a lot of other people would have, and everybody will want to know what it is when they see it in the garden, especially when it's actively growing and it has more of this kind of gold coloration on the outside of it. But this is Frankie Boy Arborvitae. This is Angiostar fatshedra from the Southern Living Plant Collection, a intergenus hybrid between Fatsia japonica, which is a shrub, and ivy, which is a climber spreading plant. It gets the best of both worlds from the two parent plants. It can climb on things, but you have to attach it. It doesn't attach itself up there, so it doesn't do damage to your structure. It has sterile seed. It has flowers in the fall that produce seed. The pollinators love the flowers, the birds love the seed, but they're sterile, so it's not going to spread itself all over the place like ivy. And then there's been a bunch of selections like Angiostar here that have these beautiful variegations, and this one is just one of the tops. It starts off with kind of a yellow and green variegation and settles into kind of an off-white and green variegation. And again, this is an evergreen. It's hardy in zone 7B to 9 or 7B to 10. In zone 7, I would probably spring plant it because it is a little winter sensitive. It needs to go in a shady space, which is where we've got it in a perfect ideal conditions here. It's getting about 2 or 2.5 hours of direct sun, and I think it does need that a little bit of direct sun to keep this really vibrant color. I think it's a little more dull in shadier conditions. We're using it to climb on the corner of our screen porch here, but it can be used as a ground cover. It can be used in a container. It can be used as an indoor plant in colder areas where it can be outside and then brought inside. It can be limbed up into kind of a small tree form. All kinds of uses for this plant, and it's one of these 4-season plants. It's always doing something. It's super, super interesting, and we just love it. This is Angiostar fatshedra. This is Utopia Plum Yew, or Cephalotaxis Harringtonia utopia. This is a Southern Living Plant Collection conifer. It reaches about 3 to 4 feet in height by about 3 to 4 feet in width. Has a great kind of habit, like where it comes out like this and then comes up slowly and ends up about this wide and about this tall. Fantastic plant in part shade or shade conditions. These are hardy in zone 6 to 10, so a lot of people watching can grow this plant. A great addition on a slope in a shady space or in a mass grouping or an individual plant or as a container plant. Really a lot of uses for this plant. This is one of those plants that once it's established really doesn't need much from you. You can fertilize it in the late winter, prune it just when it needs to be pruned, really, or prune a crazy limb off of it anytime. Won't need any general pruning. Deer resistant, rabbit resistant, all those kinds of things. Water them if it's abnormally dry in your area, because conifers aren't great at letting you know they're dry. But other than that, this is a great plant it and forget it in the shade kind of evergreen. Utopia Plum Yew. This is Rose's Blush Blueberry. This is a named variety of a blueberry that's native to the Gulf Coast of the United States. Hardy in zone 8 to 10. Darrow's blueberries are acid-loving blueberries, just like all blueberries are. They get pinkish white flowers that hang down earlier in the spring. Almost finished up with those now. Pollinators came along, and there's a lot of pollinators that love these native blueberries. Came along, and now we have just this thing's absolutely covered in blueberries. The blueberries don't all mature at the same time on this, and so the birds will get to take them a little bit at a time. Of course, they're edible for you as well. They're a little smaller than the blueberries that we're used to buying from the grocery store, but still quite beautiful. This is a 4-season plant, really beautiful plant. You get the flowers on it in the early spring, you get the berry set, you get this narrow foliage. It's called Rose's Blush because it has this beautiful rose-colored purplish new growth on it that kind of settles into a blue-green. Really narrow, fine textured habit, looks great in the garden. Full sun, zones 8 to 10, Rose's Blush Blueberry.